Clinical depression is frequently described as the defining ailment of the 21st century, with millions of new cases diagnosed across the globe every year. This manual, the DSM-5, serves as the current clinical standard. It requires patients to meet a specific set of diagnostic criteria, ranging from a persistent loss of interest in daily life to physical fatigue and a measurable decline in cognitive function. Yet, the symptoms we treat today are the same ones documented by the Greek physician Hippocrates 2,500 years ago. Without the benefit of brain imaging or modern chemistry, our ancestors were forced to invent frameworks to explain why the mind turns against itself. Mapping the history of this condition reveals the changing models humanity has used to define the boundaries between biology and the human spirit. Hippocrates founded his medical practice on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. He called this sadness melancholia, meaning black bile. An overproduction of this fluid clouded the patient's mood and thoughts. Because the problem was viewed as a physical surplus, the treatments were equally physical. Doctors prescribed strict diets to cool the body and used violent purgatives to flush the supposed toxins from the system. This biological view vanished during the Middle Ages, replaced by a theological one. The Church described a state of spiritual apathy called acedia, often observed in monks who had withdrawn from society. By shifting the focus from the body to the soul, depression became a moral failing. Suffering was no longer a medical imbalance. It was framed as a spiritual temptation or a divine punishment that required prayer rather than medicine. The Renaissance brought a return to classical thought, reviving Aristotle's ancient suspicion that melancholy was an essential component of the creative mind. Scholars began cataloging this melancholic temperament as a fundamental human type, perhaps most famously in Robert Burton's exhaustive 1621 study, The Anatomy of Melancholy. By the 19th century, this had evolved into the spleen, a romanticized darkness embraced by artists like Charles Baudelaire. For the Romantics, a heavy heart was proof of a sensitive soul and an intellectual depth that the common world couldn't reach. While this gave the condition a poetic status, it reinforced the idea that depression was an inescapable part of an individual's identity, rather than a clinical disorder that could be cured. A medical revolution in the early 1800s began to replace these poetic descriptions with the rigorous, analytical observation used by naturalists. Philippe Pinel helped lead this transition at the Bicêtre Hospital in Paris. He advocated for moral treatment, arguing that patients should be unchained and spoken to, operating on the belief that even in madness, a remnant of reason remained. This work allowed later clinicians like Emile Kraepelin to categorize mental disorders with new precision. Kraepelin's most significant move was splitting mental illness into two distinct categories: disorders of thought and disorders of emotion. This distinction established clinical depression as a specific biological ailment of the emotional sphere, creating the medical framework we still use to diagnose the disease today. In the early 20th century, psychoanalysis shifted the focus back to the mind's internal history. Freud argued that melancholy was a psychological response to loss, where the patient's ego identified with a lost object until it consumed itself. While Freud explored the psyche, others sought a physical reset. Doctors began using shock methods, including early electroconvulsive therapy, in an attempt to forcefully interrupt the brain's patterns of despair. The most significant shift occurred in the 1950s, with the accidental discovery of the first antidepressants and neuroleptics. These drugs targeted chemical mediators in the brain. They showed that mood was regulated by neurotransmitters, like serotonin and dopamine, moving across the empty gaps between our neurons. This discovery returned psychiatry to a biological perspective. While the ancient theory of black bile was physically wrong, the underlying suspicion that an internal bodily malfunction caused the disease had finally found its modern evidence in neurochemistry. Contemporary neuroscience is now looking beyond the simple balance of neurotransmitter levels. We are now studying brain plasticity, how severe stress and trauma cause neurons to physically shrink and lose connections, rewiring the brain's architecture. Modern treatments are increasingly focused on stimulating neurotrophic factors. These are specific molecules that signal the brain to repair these damaged pathways and regrow the connections lost during a depressive episode. Today's clinical model connects these historical threads. We recognize depression as a biological event, shaped by the psychological responses Freud studied and the environmental stressors that have haunted humanity for millennia. By understanding this timeline, we see the condition not as a modern failing, but as an ancient human obstacle we are finally learning to navigate.